From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we will be looking at the U.S.-Russian relationship, particularly after the latest summit between Presidents Trump and Putin in Helsinki and the evolving relationship there. With me to discuss these two issues are from Moscow, Dr. Andrey Kortunov, who is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and somebody who works on Middle Eastern issues in particular in Moscow and has for a long time. Andrey, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And from the great state of Ohio, our colleague, Dr. Randa Slim, director of our Track 2 Dialogues Initiative here at the Middle East Institute. Randa, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you and Andrey, Paul.
The relationship obviously might have great impacts, obviously, on the global order, on alignments between the U.S., Western Europe, and Russia, on the relationship with China. But our concerns at the Middle East Institute, naturally, is what effects it has had, it might have, on policy and developments in the Middle East itself. This podcast, I would say, is timely in that Dr. Randa Slim just assembled a group in Berlin. Randa, why don't you tell us about that?
This group, we call it the U.S.-Russia Middle East Dialogue. It is co-convened by the Middle East Institute and the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. We meet twice a year, and as you just said, it was timely coming on the eve of the Helsinki Summit. So it was a great opportunity for a group of academic think tankers from Russia and the United States to come together, discuss what happened in Helsinki, the implications, long-term, medium, long-term implications. And then this meeting also, we spent some time taking a step back, a larger perspective on opportunities and challenges facing U.S.-Russian cooperation, especially in the Middle East, and what kind of recommendation we can make to our respective governments in terms of how working together in some arenas where it's possible in the Middle East can create some common ground for building a better relationship between the United States and Russia.
Thank you, Randa. Here in the U.S., surrounding the Helsinki Summit, there seemed to be not much knowledge about what was actually said in the summit. Even people in the U.S. government don't seem to know, were there any agreements made, what was exactly said. Andrey, I know you were involved a little bit in the run-up and the preparations for the summit from the Russian side. Could you tell us a bit about that and how the preparations were made and maybe what the readout has been on that summit from the Russian side?
Well, first of all, let me say that unfortunately, the meeting in Helsinki was overshadowed by just one issue, the alleged Russian engagement in the U.S. political process. The rest was not really discussed in the media or even among experts. However, I do recall that when we started working on this meeting and we were looking for low-hanging fruits, I think both sides, not just the Russian side, but also the U.S. Embassy here in Moscow and John Bolton, who came to Moscow earlier, suggested that we should keep Middle East in mind because this is a region where there is a considerable overlap of U.S. and Russian interests. And I hope that these ideas were discussed in Helsinki. I hope that there were some agreements, at least on the southwest of Syria. And maybe, we can expect more predictability in the U.S.-Russian interaction in this particular region. I think it is really important because this is one of the few regions where Russians confront Americans directly. And if things go wrong, we can have an inadvertent escalation. We have something really very serious between our two countries. So I do hope that the meeting in Helsinki somehow not only confirmed the existing channels of communication on the ground between the Russian and the U.S. military, but probably led to a broader understanding on what the two states want to accomplish in Syria and how their respective goals can be reconciled.
Thanks, Andrey. Randa, I mean, from the meeting itself, as you know, and you're sort of convening it, how did you see sort of common interest in Syria and divergent interest? How would you describe that map, as it were?
I think, we can think about it in terms of regions of Syria and then issues, in Syria over which we diverge. There are certain divergence and convergence on the conflict itself. For example, if we take the Southwest, I think what has happened in the Southwest is a fait accompli. It's not something that the Americans like, but I think they acknowledge that it has happened and they have to deal with it. I think the problem going forward is going to be places like Idlib and the concern whether what happened in Ghouta, in eastern Ghouta, what happened in Dar'a, in the southwest, will happen again in Idlib, which is going to lead to a massive wave of refugees and lots of destructions. And there was a discussion in the Berlin meeting about, how to handle Idlib and, whether Turkey should be given the lead role in handling Idlib with all its complication, and that Russia and the United States could work together to prevent something in Idlib on the scale of what happened in East Ghouta and Southwest. We discussed also the idea of humanitarian assistance, collaboration on that, U.S.-Russian collaboration. We also discussed the idea of, stabilization, reconstruction, and the American side was very clear that given what unfolded in Syria in the past in terms of setting aside the military deconfliction channel, which worked, but on other issues where the Americans and the Russians tried to collaborate, from the de-escalation zones, the 4 de-escalation zones, to securing humanitarian assistance, that collaboration did not succeed in the past, which created an element of mistrust. And so going forward, the Americans are going to be a little bit careful about collaborating with the Russian on the issue of humanitarian assistance, refugee repatriation, as has transpired from the Helsinki meeting, as well as on the issue of reconstruction. I think it's going to be very hard for the U.S. to contribute to reconstruction in Syria as long as Assad is in power. However, there are areas in Syria where we can collaborate. I think dealing with Iran and Iranian ambition in Syria and the region, these are areas where we can have some discussion and sharing of perspectives. And I think the group also came to a recommendation that definitely there needs to be a discussion between the two governments on what are our respective interests and what are the red lines. As Andrey has said, there is really a fear of our respective allies, Israel and Iran, dragging both countries into a wider military confrontation. And so there is some utility in the two governments having this discussion about what are our respective red lines in Syria.
Thank you for that, Randa. Andrey, let me turn to you on sort of two aspects. The operations in southwest Syria, which, whether it's reluctantly or indirectly, are being sort of accepted by the U.S. and Israel and Jordan, I would say. Maybe accepted is a strong word, but something like that. Rely on the assumption that this is a Russian-Syrian operation and that it should exclude, to a large degree, sort of the Iranians in that area. And I think that's a very important experiment, that perhaps the Trump administration is okay with the Russians and even maybe, allowing the Assad regime to be in certain places, as is Israel, but very not okay with having the Iranians. That might apply to the Southwest. In the near future, it might apply to the Northeast, where the U.S. and the Kurdish and Arab forces are. So my first question to you, Andrey, is to what degree is there sort of a Russian Assad regime operation that can function, at least in parts of Syria, without the Iranians?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that just yesterday I paid a visit to the Israeli ambassador in Moscow, and I spoke to a couple of diplomats at the embassy, and that happened right after Israelis grounded a Syrian aircraft. And I would say that they were okay with the Russian reaction to this unfortunate incident, because Russia, of course, protested, but basically it was not a lot more than this protest. So my feeling is that there is a direct line of communication between Russia and Israel, and both sides understand both limitations and opportunities that they have in their cooperation. I think you are right. I think that there is a tacit or maybe explicit agreement that the operation in the southwest will be primarily a Syrian operation with some air support from Russia. It might result with some permanent deployment of the Russian military police in the region, but Iranians are not supposed to take part in this operation. The big question is whether it is good enough for Israelis and for Americans, whether it is something that Americans and Israelis can live with, or rather they would call for much more serious limitations on the Iranian activities in Syria, including, for example, what Iranians are doing in terms of the military hardware production in Syria. I think this is one of the issues which are very sensitive to Israelis. So I think that that remains an issue for further discussions. And I just hope that we will be able to find some kind of fine calibrated compromise, because definitely you cannot push Iranians hard and expect them to yield under pressure. I think that whether we like it or not, but it might have a clear counterproductive effect.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to that, dig down a bit on the sort of Russian-Iranian relationship, as you said, and as we discussed in Berlin. It might be realistic to arrive at least at parts of Syria which maybe do not have an Iranian presence, like the southwest, maybe the northeast, who knows, with Russian-Syrian cooperation, but that it's unlikely to be able at all to push Iran completely out of Syria, and it might be more about red lines and what might be tolerated and what might not, and that's a very sort of gray red line, if I may use the term. But it's also interesting, I would like our listeners to hear a little bit from you, Andrey, that how would you sort of explain the broader Russian-Iranian relationship, that obviously it's much more than Syria, and, hence, where is the balance there? Where are the common interests between those two countries in other parts of the relationship?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think that quite often the nature of this relationship is not well understood in the West, because when our American friends tell us, no, you should basically drop your alliance with Iran and you should get to the right side of history, at least in this conflict, I think that the United States, at least under this administration, looks at Syria primarily from the Israeli lens. But for Russia, Iran is something which is much broader than the Middle East conflict. And when we think about Iran, we think about Afghanistan and the drug traffic and potential terrorism that might have a spillover impact on neighboring countries. When we think about Iran, we think about Tajikistan, which went through a civil war. We are thinking about Central Asia in general, and this region remains potentially quite dangerous because it faces tremendous social and economic problems, and also a political transition, the outcomes of which it is very difficult to predict. We're talking about South Caucasus, because Iran does play a role in places like Armenia and Azerbaijan. So for us, Iran is much bigger than it is for the United States, at least the way I see it. And therefore, we cannot take this black and white approach to Iran. We might agree and disagree with Tehran, but we will remain neighbors, and therefore we should try to preserve some kind of cooperation. Though, again, I have to say, dealing with Iranians, I'm not sure that Iranians completely trust Russians or Russians trust Iranians. It is a complicated relationship.
Thank you. Andrey, also, Randa, let me ask you a similar question. I mean, in the U.S.-Russian dialogue as relates to the Middle East and our own dialogue about it, obviously the main focus in Syria, and that's understandable. If you pulled back a bit, what could you say about the U.S.-Russian relationship as relates to some of the broader issues in the Middle East? So you have Afghanistan, you have the JCPOA, and Yemen. What are some of the broader, wider issues, or even the peace process?
I would like to, if you allow me, I would like to more focus on the positive and focus us on what are potential areas of convergence or collaboration, if we can put it this way, of shared interest, and where we both share some of the threat assessment that's coming from these particular arenas. I think what came here in Berlin meeting is that there is definitely an area where we can cooperate. We have not done as well in the past, but I think this is an arena where there is potential room for collaboration, and that's the area of counterterrorism. And we need to approach it with a broader lens than the kinetic approach and look at it through, stabilization, conflict prevention, development. So taking that, I think, as an opportunity for potential collaboration. There is also another arena, which is the countering weapons of mass destruction. And here, not focused purely on the Iranian nuclear challenge, although it includes it, but also, the whole, the CW, the chemical weapons. There has been a bad precedent for somehow not a totally successful precedent. I mean, limited success in countering CW used by Assad, but, more work needed to be done. But to focus on nuclear proliferation in a broader sense in the Middle East is something. And recently, yesterday we have seen, and today we have heard some of the Iranian comments by the Iranian Quds Force commander, General Soleimani, threatening the U.S. presence in the Red Sea. So the third challenge and shared objective is to securing access for global energy and commerce, especially in the maritime domain. And this is something that both the Russians and the Americans can work together. And finally, I would focus on this arena of Iran and the Iranian threats. I think there is shared concern about Iranian activities in the region, not only in terms of their scope, and Andrey referred to the entrenchment of Iranian military infrastructure and weapons production capacities in Syria, but also the Iranian role in Yemen, especially as it affects this whole access to, maritime access for energy transport routes. And there is also an opportunity we discussed in Berlin related to what Arley said in terms of this complicated and complex Russian-Iranian relationship. What are the opportunities? The takeaway for me from the discussion in Berlin is that Russia sees Iran both as a stabilizing factor in some of the arenas or areas that Andrey mentioned, but also Russia sees Iran as a destabilizing factor in some other arenas. And so there are certain opportunities which we can mine in our discussions on what are those opportunities where we can work together in meeting some of these challenges and including in meeting some of the problems we both have and with respect to Iran.
Andrey, let me end with you. Final question. Looking forward, the two presidents met in Helsinki. President Trump later announced that there is an invitation for President Putin to come to Washington. That might have been in the fall. Now President Trump has said it'll probably be next year. But there might also, now that Mr. Bolton has come to Moscow, and there might be more interaction between the two administrations. In a few words, how do you see the immediate future of the U.S.-Russian relationship as relates to the Middle East?
It's a good question. I think that hopefully we'll see broader interaction between various layers of bureaucracies. That includes diplomats, it includes the military. Hopefully it would also include intelligence. If we have this broader interaction, we might narrow the gaps in positions where we have these gaps. And I think that working together, we might push the Geneva process forward. It will be very difficult. I think there are many obstacles which don't depend just on Russia or the United States. But working together, I think we can make some progress. Not a revolution, but some progress can be achieved.
Time is short, Andrey, but we, had been extremely worried about an Iranian-Israeli escalation. But the last, I would say, 48 hours, perhaps the worry now is more directly a U.S. or Iranian-U.S. escalation. In a few words, is that something that's drawing a lot of attention in Moscow? Is there anything Russia can do to sort of de-escalate that clash?
Well, that depends on the level of flexibility or inflexibility on the U.S. side. I think that Russia would be happy to act as a broker or as a middleman between the United States and Iran, but in order to do that, it needs to have not just sticks for Iran, but also some carrots. And at this point, I don't see any carrots offered by the United States to Iran. It might change, but so far I'm unaware of any positive incentives that the United States can present to Iran.
Yeah, it's interesting that, on the case with North Korea, there was a similar period of escalation, which looked much more dangerous because it was nuclear and the name calling was much worse. So it seemed to be like it was all sticks for a while and then all carrots for a while, rather than a bit of both.
It has been interesting that Mr. Trump has not resorted to name calling to the Supreme Leader or to Qasem Soleimani. Maybe he will do that today, but
well, we shall see what develops. Andrey Kortunov joining us from Moscow, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Andrey, thank you so much for taking your time today.
Thank you.
And my dear friend and colleague, Randa Slim, joining us from Ohio, director of our Middle East Dialogues Initiative here at MEI. Thank you for convening that very important meeting, and thanks for being with us today, Randa. Have a good day.
Thank you. Good day to you too.
And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in to this podcast. Join us on Facebook for any comments or queries, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.